Movement is the means by which an organism traverses its environment, and depending on the species, it can comprise a significant amount of an animal's existence. Movement achieves a number of goals. Be it foraging or hunting, fleeing or exploring, it's typically the most mechanically challenging task an organism must perform, and can place serious energetic demands on the body. The distance and speed with which a creature moves can vary greatly. Some species may take minutes to move a single body length, while others can traverse large stretches of a planet's circumference within their lifetime. We will see examples of each in today's episode and discuss the evolutionary reasons a species might evolve to do one or the other. Any given movement by an organism around its environment can be placed into one of two categories. The first is known as kinesis, where an individual maneuvers through its surroundings at random, altering its speed or trajectory only for discrete stimuli and unconscious neural processes. Common stimuli on Isla which might trigger such shifts in random movement include moisture, light intensity, temperature, and concentrations of chemical compounds like sulfates, nitrates, or ammonia. This kind of movement is often less energetically demanding and sees the animal moving through its environment undirected, affected only by conditions which help to maintain its homeostasis. The second category, known as taxis, involves movements which are specifically directed, often executed by the animal in order to move toward or away from any of the stimuli we previously mentioned. In macroscopic organisms, taxis is often associated with higher-order functioning and commonly demands that an animal orient itself and target a certain area to which it is drawn or repelled. Various prefixes can be assigned to this word to better specify the stimuli in question. These include phototaxis, for motion directed by light levels within the environment, anemotaxis, for motion occurring in response to Isla's winds, and chemotaxis, describing motion affected by chemical cues. In the context of many of the species we are about to discuss, significant taxis requires navigation, and it is the category of movement that we will be primarily focusing on when discussing megafaunal migrations. Beyond these classifications, movement is also mechanical. Part of understanding an organism and its behavior is understanding how its body works internally and how it facilitates locomotion. For the purposes of understanding the movement of terrestrial species, we will first cover the mechanics of the legs used by much of Isla's decapod life, and how these appendages allow for varying kinds of motion. So without further ado, this is the Isla Project. In order to discuss the behavior surrounding animal locomotion, we must first understand how they move on a physiological and anatomical level. For the purposes of this episode, we will be looking exclusively at decapod species, specifically osteopods belonging to the taxonomic phylum Polynodata. It's important to note that while the anatomy and mechanics we are about to cover are applicable to many terrestrial species, they by no means cover the entire scope of fauna native to the planet, or even all belonging to this phylum. First, let's cover the basic leg anatomy of osteopods. Like on Earth, much of Isla's fauna evolved limbs to aid in locomotion. This characteristic first developed in the seas, where progenitor decapods crawled along the seafloor using rudimentary hydraulic-based legs that used shifting internal pressure to extend and retract. With the transition onto land, however, more complex structures arose in these limbs in order to accommodate a higher gravity environment. Most notable was the development of calcified bone segments in each leg, a feature which earned the clade osteopoda its name. In the legs of modern osteopods, this bone structure is known as the nodal sheath, a long segmented chain composed of interlinking cone-shaped units. With the help of various muscle groups, the nodal sheath helps to give structure and rigidity to the leg and also facilitates the organism's ability to extend and retract the limb at will. When walking, all osteopods are capable of stretching or shrinking the length of the sheath, and by extension the leg itself, by about 40%. This is done through a hydraulic pressure system that is located within the bone structure. Through a central aqueduct, fluids can be pumped in and out of the leg, inducing a structural change in the nodal sheath. When liquid is pumped into the aqueduct, creating a high-pressure system, it fills small vesicles located on the inside of each cone-shaped bone. The expansion of these vesicles pushes each segment apart, causing the entire structure to grow in length. When fluid is pulled from this system, the nodes are forced together into a tighter configuration, shortening the length of the sheath. This hydraulic system, in controlling the state of the central bone structure, also controls the length of the entire leg. The number of bone nodes within the limb varies between organisms. Some low-lying decapods have as few as 15 in each appendage, whereas other decapods, a clade known for their exceptionally long legs, have upwards of 100 segments. The nodal sheath and central aqueduct together can dictate the length of the leg. However, they cannot position or articulate the limb in any way. This is left up to a number of contractor and extensor muscles surrounding the nodal sheath. Muscle groups located at the base of the leg allow for the limb to be moved forward and backward, as well as pitched perpendicularly to the creature's form. Walking is facilitated by the coordinated action of these legs, and different patterns of retraction, articulation, and extension of the limbs allow for varying speeds and modes of movement. Generally, the legs are moved in a wave-like formation, with the retraction of one prompting the same motion in the leg behind it, and so on down the body of the organism. This gait is comparable to that of myriapods on Earth, and is the most energy-efficient way for decapods to locomote. In some situations, this pattern of motion may change, and instead we see alternation of the extension and retraction that occurs between pairs of limbs. This motion is fairly comparable to the walking cycles that we see of many quadrupedal animals. Another aspect of faunal movement worthy of note is the multidirectional capabilities exhibited by some species, specifically those belonging to the taxonomic class Dercostra. Decapods are one of the more ancient terrestrial clades on Isla, and their strange movement and body plans are indicative of this. Unlike many of their more recent evolutionary relatives, these creatures mostly lack a uniform head and instead have sensory organs and associated processing areas located on both ends of their body. On the wider, typically better armored abdorostral end, many of the vital organs are housed, as well as the oral cavity and arms, 2 sets of eyes, and an array of other sensory organs. On the other side of the body, known as the distothoracic end, excretory organs and the gonads are located, as well as a pair of eyes and various tactile appendages. Decapostrad body plans are far less centralized than many species with which we are familiar, and this is best demonstrated by the unique neuroanatomy housed within the abdorostral and distothoracic sections. Both segments contain separate sensory and motor processing cortices, which work in tandem to control the whole organism and dictate its behaviors. As a result of this bizarre neurological network, many decapostrad behaviors may appear foreign, including their basic movement. In many species, the direction of movement is associated with different goals and actions dictated by the aforementioned cortices. In larger herding species like Opanoia cinereus, undirected kinesis and general traversal is done with the abdorostral end leading, as this area of the body is more heavily equipped with sensory organs and is better armored. When this occurs, the cortex within the abdomen is largely responsible for executing the movements. During other behaviors like social taxis, decapostrads change their walking orientation to one with the distothoracic end leading. In all decapods, this end houses the reproductive organs of the animal, and thus, it is largely associated with mating behavior and social displays. When this mode of locomotion is adopted, executive control of motion is largely handed over to the cortex housed within the distothoracic end. Between species, the different behaviors associated with directionality vary based on the wide array of pressures placed on an organism throughout its life. In a close cousin, Opanoia adenisi, varying directionality helps to protect herds from pursuing packs of predators. These creatures live in large social groups and migrate across vast distances together. When they encounter predators looking to surround and attack them, the herd organizes themselves in a defensive configuration. Individuals on the outside of their group walk in an orientation which puts their better armored abdorostral end between the threat and the rest of the herd. This means that those at the front move with this body section leading, while those trailing at the back alter their movements so that the distothoracic end leads, and their flanks are protected via the abdomen. In summary, the herd of Opanoia adenisi are able to protect themselves from attack by strategically varying their directional movement, creating a sort of biological phalanx. With this basic understanding of decapod physiology and the various behaviors behind locomotion, it's time to discuss one of the most prevalent and ecologically impactful aspects of movement in Isla's fauna: migration. Migration is the long-distance movement of species from one region of a planet to another. On Earth, migration is most often seasonal, with animals traveling along learned or innately programmed routes between habitats. Migratory species periodically embark on these journeys in order to access specific breeding or feeding grounds in the accommodating seasons. On Isla, much of this is also true. However, there are some key differences which are the result of unfamiliar planetary characteristics. Firstly, the planet Isla has very low obliquity, which means that it is tilted very little in relation to its axis of orbit. This results in very little seasonal variation in its climate, and thus, the migratory behaviors of species we will soon discuss are not based around a seasonal impetus. Most migrations across the planet are continuous, and they can vary greatly in the distance they cover. Some are restricted to certain regions of the planet, whereas others see herds of species traversing the entire circumference of the globe. Some migratory routes vary amongst a single species thanks to differing localization across the planet. For example, Opanoia cinereus herds travel in two distinct loops as the range their species occupies is geographically separated by unaccommodating badlands. In other cases, creatures all follow the same path, albeit traveling in their own individual herds. Dolichoceps enolia is an example of this, as every individual of the species makes a pilgrimage between Lake Amano and the Iudronta supercolony using the same migratory route. Migration can be extremely hazardous, so it isn't a behavioral strategy adopted by all organisms. Precarious terrain, harsh weather conditions, and predatory species are all threats that an organism can encounter as it makes its way from one region to another. For some, however, the benefits are worth the risk. Migratory behavior can be advantageous for a variety of reasons, but on Isla, it primarily serves to expand the resources available to a creature, allowing them to physically move away from any given range when it becomes exhausted of food, water, or other essential nutrients. All animals have a natural territory within which they go about their existence, and many don't require so many resources that they will ever see the range's supply exhausted. Some species of grazing megafauna, however, eat at a pace which requires them to move between native habitats. While photosynthetic autotrophs on Isla are highly successful, floral biomass is, on average, less than it is on Earth, and thus plant populations are more susceptible to depletion from grazing fauna. For migratory species like Zygoscapus giganteum, constantly traveling across the planet allows them to move away from ranges that can no longer accommodate them, and gives time for those ranges to revitalize before they return. In the case of this species specifically, herds circumnavigate the planet's biotic zone. These migrations take more than 50 Earth years to complete, making them the largest mass movement of creatures within Isla's entire biosphere. With a lifespan of no more than 15 Earth years, multiple generations live and die in the time it takes for the herd to return to any single region of the globe. No individual will ever complete the entire journey. However, in migrating, they can ensure the regions their progeny inherit can sustain them. This idea is generally applicable across most migratory species. The act of moving a population across regions of the planet helps to maintain the stability of the ecosystems frequented by each species. It's important to note that this is not a conscious biological process, or in other words, individuals aren't using foresight to ensure the success of themselves and future generations. Instead, this is a collective behavior which evolved over millions of years as megafauna grew to prominence across Isla's terrestrial environments. Energetically consumptive species which strayed from their home ranges were more successful, as the environments they relied on were less stressed by large populations and maintained greater carrying capacities in the long run. This became extra beneficial in areas frequented by many different species, and ultimately resulted in the synced movement of organisms around the edge of the biotic zone. There are a number of factors which make migration evolutionarily costly. For some species, physiology may limit the ability to travel between different latitudes, particularly for organisms who are especially suited to their native climate and have difficulty adapting to foreign ones. Examples include most members of the phylogenetic order Dercostra, whose metabolisms and means of thermoregulation are specialized for warmer conditions north of 15 degrees latitude. This is one major reason why very few Dercostrids display migratory behavior, and almost all that do travel within a narrow range of latitudes, rarely crossing significant climatic boundaries. Conversely, Catarrhinx species, which can be found inhabiting the cold, darker regions within or even south of the Terminator Zone, have specifically evolved to inhabit these chillier habitats. Thick coats of fur accompanied by specialized respiratory and circulatory systems make thermoregulation difficult in warmer climates to the north, and thus we tend to see them remain in southern latitudes. Clades such as these are far less suited to significant migration compared to others that are better adapted to variable climates. But what physiologies are most compatible with cross-latitude migration? In episode 2, we briefly touched on a wide group of fauna who could shift the pigmentation in their skin in order to alter their body temperature. By modifying how well their skin absorbs heat from Isla's star, these fauna can rapidly adapt to temperature difference between latitudes and small-scale features of their environment, like shaded or light-exposed areas. Species like this are far more likely to display migratory behaviors in comparison to the two previous example clades, which have far more specific thermoregulatory capabilities. To summarize, organisms capable of thriving in variable conditions are far better suited to cross-latitude migration, and thus embark on the more dramatic odysseys that we see across Isla. As we mentioned though, there are certain specifically adapted species that can also participate in migration. However, these travels tend to be more confined to a few degrees of latitudinal change. But how do these migratory species navigate? Earlier, we touched on the fact that some organisms are known to migrate distances as large as the entire circumference of the planet, so how can they possibly know where they're going? There are a number of different stimuli which fauna use to orient themselves and determine their direction of movement. Typically, migratory species of Isla travel along latitudinal lines, generally east to west, with deviation to the north and south occurring as the result of environmental factors. In order to measure their position on the globe, many species have developed the ability to analyze the angle of Isla's star in the sky, which allows them to determine the latitude on which they are traveling and to correct their course if necessary. In addition to this, the vast majority of fauna on Isla are able to detect another stimulus, one which is extremely important for long-distance navigation. Magnetoception, or an organism's ability to sense magnetic fields, is widely utilized among migratory and non-migratory species alike, as it is one of the most accurate means of determining global positioning. Isla has a dense core of molten iron, which generates a strong magnetic field around the planet. Animals capable of magnetoception have specialized cells in their body which can interact with this magnetic field, and thus indicate the creature's position in relation to Isla's magnetic poles. Used in tandem with the angle of Isla's star, this sense allows organisms to pinpoint their position on the planet with an accuracy on the level of kilometers. An example of this can be seen in Dolichoceps enolia, which uses these finely tuned senses to return to a very specific region of the planet along their migratory route. This species spawns between the outskirts of the vast Eudronta supercolony and the shores of Lake Amano. This area is a hotspot for biological diversity, providing relative safety, nourishment, and enrichment for the young, so it's important that these creatures can periodically locate this region in order to give their progeny the best chance of survival. Another important tool that some creatures use for travel, both on large and small scales, are mental maps, or the ability for an individual to take note of features of its environment and navigate accordingly. In non-migratory species, creatures that can recall features of their surroundings are more successful at establishing territories and home ranges. Migratory species, on the other hand, can use mental mapping to better navigate familiar routes, especially if they've been repeatedly traveled. When these navigational tools, phototaxis, magnetotaxis, and mental mapping, are utilized collectively, they enable animals to complete complex journeys across varied and dangerous terrain. Without them, these odysseys would be far too perilous to be evolutionarily advantageous. The migrations of various species can greatly affect the environments through which they pass. In a physical sense, the mass movement of megafauna can make a mark on the landscape. Platyphyte species of the plains are carved away and eaten, opening up space for new generations to grow. Dirt and sand are trampled down by countless padded feet, molding paths into the landscape upon which others will travel. Importantly, regions left behind by large herds are often covered with nutrient-rich feces, a parting gift from the travelers which helps to enrich the ecosystem even after they've long gone. Certain environments entirely rely on these droppings for bioproductivity. One region, a flat stretch to the east of the Great Eodronta forests, springs to life upon the passage of traveling Delicoceps anolia and the fecal waste they leave behind. As the land becomes revitalized, fungi and phototrophs alike temporarily take root. In response, subterranean species emerge from their burrows to feed on the newly available flora. Once dormant predators spring back to life once again and begin to hunt the newly available prey. This ecosystem is vibrant, however, it won't last long, and soon, the rich deposit of nutrients and minerals from the animal's waste is depleted. When this time inevitably comes, the fauna will return to their burrows and enter yet another state of dormancy. Most of the small plants that were able to grow will wither and die, unable to sustain themselves on the nutrient-poor soil. Before this happens, though, they will have been able to implant small, resilient seed pods in the soil beneath them. These tiny progeny will lie dormant with the rest of the life in this region. Together they will wait, only springing to life again once another herd passes through on a journey to its native breeding grounds. Migration also has effects that extend beyond the physical environment. It promotes niche partitioning, allowing for unique organisms to get a footing in strange environments with lifestyles supported by passing herds. Certain species, like the aquatic Acoiderosa amanuensis, have evolved to take advantage of those same Delicoceps anolia. Residing within the floodplains near their spawning grounds, these fish clean parasites and encrusting organisms from the hides of the migrating creatures. This mutualistic behavior is encouraged by Delicoceps anolia, which will stop along their journey to bathe in the waters and allow for the small fish to clean them. The megafauna will partially submerge themselves, and not long after, schools of Acoiderosa amanuensis will flock to their underbelly, gently picking off dead skin or harmful species that have been picked up along the journey. This provides an easy and reliable food source for Acoiderosa amanuensis and a means of maintaining health for Delicoceps anolia. Not all relations are mutualistic, however. Migration affects the behaviors of predatory species as well. Some, like Crocuta amblyodonta, migrate along with the creatures they hunt, following the herd and picking off any older or newborn stragglers that fall behind. Close association of predator and prey has led to an evolutionary arms race, specifically when it comes to the group dynamics of each species. Dolichomaxidae albidens are hunters with various sets of jaws which have evolved to effectively trap and tear away at the tough hide of prey. Most importantly, they hunt in packs, as cooperation with others of their kind increases the likelihood of a successful kill. In response, many of the herding prey species have evolved to travel in greater numbers, increasing the chances of survival for any given individual. Other predatory species establish territorial ranges along known migratory routes, taking advantage of areas where they can ambush the groups that periodically pass through. While this is observed in some pack hunters, this behavior often favors predatory species which can expend as little energy as possible between kills. For this reason, ambush predation is popular across a variety of clades located along migratory paths. Instead of pursuing their prey, ambush predators situate themselves in areas where target organisms are likely to pass by. Some conceal themselves in subterranean burrows, while others find convenient caves, gullies, and rocky alcoves within which they can hide themselves and wait. If the ambush predator is well situated, a prey species will inevitably pass too close, giving it an opportunity to strike. Ambush predation is extremely effective, and for some species, like Tegia cryptodomicli, catching a single prey item over the course of a migratory cycle is enough to sustain them for years to come. Lying motionless for 95% of its existence, it is a master of conserving energy, only making significant movement when mating and when exploding from its hiding place to surprise and subdue its prey. In the same way that migrations affect the behavior and positioning of surrounding species, they can also facilitate the spread of certain diseases which have evolved in tandem with mass movement. Viral, bacterial, and transmissible protein diseases circulate with a high intensity between 15 and 20 degrees latitude. This is due in part to the fact that planetary temperatures in this region are most accommodating for infection. In addition, this area sees the highest volume of migratory species periodically passing through. Fauna constantly interacting in large numbers and then moving on allows for many diseases to become endemic to these latitudes, and we see many of them circulate with the flow of herds moving along the planet's surface. Parasitic infection also tends to coincide with migratory behavior. Species like Angustidilampus acutus rely on megafaunal species for their sustenance, but also for their dispersal. The progeny of these toothpick-like organisms are dropped directly from the embedded female on the ground below and trampled into the soil by the host species. Here they can mature into adult parasitic stages and lie in wait for the host to return as it cycles back through its migratory route. With the reproductive cycle directly reliant on the host species, the range of this parasite correlates directly with the movement of the fauna that it targets. Another unfamiliar example is Physiology diffusus, a species of semi-parasitic pathogenic fungi which moves in waves with traveling megafauna and their predators. Within the Great Eodronta forests, large groups of the brightly colored Formosopoda floridus move in a giant loop, feeding on all means of life growing on the forest floor. Occasionally, they will come across the first stage of the fungus, which grows from Eodronta trunks and mimics the look of certain communal Interiomorpha flora, species which are favored by grazing creatures. After being consumed, spores from the fungus implant themselves in the oral arms of Formosopoda floridus. From here, it begins to fill the organs and cause inflammation of the esophagi, proceeding to sprout from the surrounding tissue. This prevents the creature from properly swallowing and taking in nutrients. Ultimately, after days of infection, the host will succumb to starvation and collapse. Left behind by its herd, its corpse will be consumed by filaments of the fungus, using it as sustenance as the parasite replicates. Inevitably, scavengers of the forest will descend upon the deceased animal, which will consume the available flesh as well as the fungal tissues inside. When the corpse has been picked clean, the scavengers will return to their lives among the trunks, where they will defecate out spores of the newly dispersed Physiology diffusus. From here, new adult structures can grow, concealing themselves once again from migrating grazers passing through that section of the forest. Just as the movements of fauna across the planet's surface influence the environment, so too does the environment influence the routes that migratory species take. Organisms which prefer certain environmental conditions will often alter their migratory routes in order to include regions which accommodate these needs, even if it means taking longer routes or crossing more perilous terrain to get there. For some species, these environmental conditions may include areas of high biodiversity, which may be telegraphed by auditory or olfactory information released by the inhabitants of the region. For others, this may mean areas with available moisture or liquid water, such as lakes, streams, or floodplains. As we previously discussed, chemotaxis and phototaxis can be used to move directly toward promising stimuli that indicate these favored conditions. Now for some specifics. Interestingly, volcanic activity is a major driver of chemotaxis on Isla. Chemical compounds deposited by geothermal activity are coveted by numerous organisms, both autotrophs and the fauna that graze on them. A good example of this can be seen in the area around Olympus Major, one of Isla's active volcanoes. A plethora of chemotrophic organisms can be found around this mountain, and many are important in supplementing the diets of megafauna. Thanks to Isla's northern blowing winds, most of the volcano's ejecta is distributed on the lands to the north, enriching these areas with chemical compounds, promoting the mass growth of chemosynthetic life. When examining the various migratory routes of species that pass nearby the mountain, it can be seen that many veer from their primary trajectories in order to cross regions north of Olympus Major. The ultimate result is that these northern areas of the volcano host significant biological diversity and are frequented by migratory species whose journeys bring them close to the mountain. This phenomenon is not specific to Olympus Major and can be observed around many of Isla's active volcanoes. A number of Isla's major biomes have developed in a way which promotes migration and attracts creatures which could benefit from their structures. For example, the massive platyphyte colonies of the arid flats have specifically evolved to maximize the dispersal of gametes through passing fauna. The layout of these colonies is such that creatures which choose to travel the biological tunnels beneath the surface will indiscriminately pick up and transmit gametes of the surrounding flora. In traveling these tunnels, the migrating animals are sheltered from the intense winds of the arid flats above, and in return aid in the reproduction of the flora making up the surrounding environment. Ridge gardens function in a similar way. With the tall Lavadontis adustus blocking winds from the south, larger migratory fauna are able to traverse the northern face of these landscapes unimpeded. Here protrudes a multitude of flowers, which for certain species contain a supplementary source of nutrients in the form of sugary nectar. Creatures passing through have access to an easy reserve of energy and in return pollinate the plants that make up the backbone of the ecosystem. From these examples, it's clear how environmental features can affect migratory behavior just as much as that same behavior shapes the surrounding ecosystems. We will see more of these interspecific relations in the future, involving organisms and environments yet to be seen in this project. Ultimately, migration is a critical behavior displayed by fauna traversing the surface of Isla. It has evolved over countless generations in order to maximize survivability, and while it can be physically demanding on the level of individual organisms, it ultimately allows for species to inhabit ecosystems which better accommodate their herds. The migrations of many creatures have evolved in tandem with each other, and though they are not consciously cooperative, their synced travel patterns reduce competition between species and allow for environments to periodically recover from herd activity. This means that the many ecosystems of the planet are sustained for future generations, and their native species benefit from the constant visitation of wandering megafauna. In future episodes, we will continue to elaborate on migration and its effects in novel contexts, but for now, that's all we have time for. In the next installment of this series, we will discuss a clade of flora which has evolved some extremely unique adaptations in order to take advantage of species passing through their home environments. These adaptations make them stand out from their phototrophic relatives, which means that they are wholly different from the floral clades which we have discussed thus far. That's all for this episode of the Isla Project. Until next time.